By the last winter of the Second World War, Europe no longer looked like a continent that believed in tomorrow. It looked like a land exhausted by its own violence, a land of broken stations, frozen tracks, burned rooftops, shattered roads, and villages that seemed to have been left behind by time itself. Armies still moved, but they moved like wounded machines. Orders were still shouted, guns still fired, flags still hung over buildings. Yet beneath all of it, beneath every march, every command, every act of discipline, there was a truth that more and more men could feel even if very few dared speak it aloud. Something immense had already been lost. Among the many caught inside that collapsing world were German prisoners of war who were being moved farther and farther from the front lines where they had been captured. Some had surrendered after days of bombardment. Some had stumbled out of forests with their hands raised. Some had been taken from crumbling houses where they had hidden from artillery. Some had simply found themselves in columns of defeated men, so large that even the officers still trying to speak of honor could no longer make defeat sound temporary. They came from many places and many kinds of units. There were hardened veterans whose faces had already become the faces of old men. There were mechanics, clerks, drivers, cooks, signalmen, replacements, boys who had been trained just long enough to be sent into disaster, and older soldiers who had once imagined they would never again wear a uniform. Some had believed in the regime with all the energy of conviction. Some had long ago stopped believing but had kept marching, because war does not ask what a tired man believes. Some still clung to pride because pride was the only possession left to them. But what united them now was not ideology. It was expectation. They expected cruelty. For years they had been told what the enemy would be. They had heard it in barracks and mess halls, in newspapers and speeches, in warnings given by officers, and in rumors traded among frightened men in the dark. The enemy would humiliate them. The enemy would break them. The enemy would take pleasure in their defeat. Surrender, they had been taught, did not lead to mercy. It led to shame, hunger, mockery, and punishment. So when these prisoners were shipped across the ocean and carried by rail deeper into the American interior, they did not ask whether their captivity would be hard. They assumed it would be. What troubled them was something else. They wondered how long the Americans would wait before showing their true face. Even the journey made them uneasy. They had been counted, searched, disarmed, loaded, moved, counted again, processed, guarded, and fed. The food was plain, but it was not poisoned by contempt. The water was rationed, but it was not intentionally foul. The guards were stern, armed, watchful, but they did not strike men for sport. To exhausted prisoners, this was not reassuring. It was suspicious. A brutal enemy would have made sense. Hatred they could have understood. Men who barked insults and used rifle, but freely would confirmed every story they had carried with them. But discipline without open cruelty felt more dangerous. It suggested patience. It suggested calculation. It suggested a trap that had not yet fully opened. America itself made them uneasy. It looked too wide, too untouched, too calm. The sky seemed larger than it had any right to be in wartime. Towns passed by train windows with neat streets, standing houses, women carrying groceries, children staring at rail cars, men pausing at work sites to watch the transports roll through. There were no smoking ruins here, no columns of refugees, no shelled church towers leaning over roads. To the prisoners, that calm felt almost offensive. This country had sent bombers and armies across oceans, and yet here it remained, buying bread, sweeping porches, moving through ordinary days. Some among the prisoners took this as proof that the Americans could afford to be patient. A rich enemy, they thought, had the luxury of taking his time. By the time they arrived at the camp that would hold them through the last bitter stretch of the war, many of them had spent so long expecting deception that they no longer knew how to interpret ordinary order. The fences, the towers, the barracks, the searchlights, the packed ground, the gates, the trucks, the barrack stoves, the mess lines, the infirmary, the supply sheds. None of it surprised them. Prison was prison. But what they did not yet understand was that the first great shock of their captivity would not come from cruelty. It would come from restraint. And they would mistrust that restraint more fiercely than they would ever have mistrusted a blow. The camp stood in open country, where the wind moved as if fences were an insult. Dust drifted in dry weather. Coal cut through seams when the temperature dropped. The whole place looked practical, not theatrical. It had been built to hold men, count men, feed men, separate men, and keep men from leaving. Nothing about it suggested softness. Inside, everything began with procedure. The prisoners were lined up, processed, examined, counted, assigned, and directed. That much they expected. What unsettled them was the manner in which it was done. The Americans did not scream because they enjoyed hearing themselves scream. They gave orders because order was required. They corrected men who stepped out of line. They enforced timing, silence, movement, and compliance. Yet they did not seem interested in inventing extra humiliations. They did not appear eager to turn helplessness into theater. A medic examined the sick as though sickness itself were the matter at hand. A clerk checked lists as though names still mattered. A supply man handed out blankets and utensils as if these were items to be issued, not favors to be dangled. The prisoners were not welcomed, and they were certainly not free, but neither were they treated as animals to be publicly broken. That difference disturbed them more than many Americans realized. When the first meals were served, suspicion deepened. The food was not fine. It was not a feast. It was camp food, plain, hot, filling enough to quiet the worst edge of hunger. Steam rose from tin trays in the cold air. Men looked down at their portions and then at one another. Some began eating at once because the body always knows what it needs. Others hesitated. Whispers moved through the line and into the barracks afterward. Do not trust this. Eat slowly. They want something. They are making us dependent. This is only the first layer. Some men laughed at such talk in private, but not loudly. In defeated groups, suspicion becomes a kind of shared shelter. To trust too soon is dangerous. To accept decent treatment too quickly is to risk becoming the fool in front of harder men. That same suspicion followed everything else. Blankets were examined as if wool itself might be deception. Medical care was treated as a possible trap. Soap, winter socks, hot water, letters home, religious services. Every practical gesture had to be explained away. The Americans, the prisoners told one another, must want something. Why else would they bother? The answer that frightened many of them was the simplest one. Because this was how the camp had been ordered to function, and because enough of the Americans in it believed that such rules mattered. That answer was far harder to live with than hatred would have been. If the enemy could exercise power without theatrical cruelty, then one of the central stories the prisoners had carried across the ocean began to weaken. To accept that possibility meant admitting that the war had taught them something false about the men now holding them behind wire. Inside the barracks, life settled into the tense rhythm that prison camps everywhere seemed to create. Men slept close enough to hear one another cough, mutter, dream, weep, or curse in the dark. The barracks smelled of damp wool, old wood, coal smoke, worn leather, and the stale fatigue of defeated soldiers. At night there were boots outside on frozen ground, stove doors clanging shut, distant voices from towers, the rattle of cups, the rustled papers unfolded under weak light. The prisoners talked in low voices and watched each other as carefully as they watched the guards. And soon another truth emerged. The camp did not contain one enemy. It contained two. Outside the prisoners stood the Americans with rifles, rules, and authority. Inside the barracks stood fear, pride, ideology, resentment, and the old habits of domination that captivity does not erase. Among the prisoners were men determined to keep the old order alive in whatever reduced form remained possible. They mocked gratitude. They sneered at men who spoke too politely to guards. They treated illness as weakness, curiosity as softness, and any visible easing of hatred as betrayal. A prison camp is never only governed from the towers. It is also governed from bunks, by whispers, by reputations, by the quiet pressure men place on one another. The Americans learned that quickly. Fights broke out. Not massive riots at first, but smaller eruptions, shoves in line, threats in corners, blows traded over rumors, ration envy, old unit loyalties, or the unbearable crime of seeming too adaptable. The guards intervened. They separated men, imposed punishment where needed, and made it clear that order inside the wire included protecting prisoners from one another. This, too, was mistrusted. Some prisoners insisted the Americans only wanted easier management. Yet even if that was partly true, it was not the whole truth. The guards did not stand aside and enjoy the sight of stronger prisoners terrorizing weaker ones. They did not turn internal violence into entertainment. They treated it as disorder, as danger, as something not to be permitted for the prisoners. Such consistency became increasingly difficult to dismiss. The same pattern appeared in the infirmary. Sick men were treated. Wounds were cleaned. Fever was checked. Cracked hands were bandaged. Coughs were listened to. Burns were dressed. A prisoner could be scolded for waiting too long to report symptoms, and then be cared for anyway. The tone was often brisk, sometimes rough, but the care was real, and still the prisoners searched for the hidden price. Mail brought the same confusion. At first, many assumed that letters home were only for show, that they would be collected and never sent, or censored so heavily that they would become another tool of manipulation. Yet replies began to arrive, slowly, unevenly, painfully, but undeniably. Folded paper passed from hand to hand. Men sat on bunks reading old handwriting as if it were the voice of another planet. Wives wrote about bomb damage, shortages, frightened children, vanished neighbors. Mothers wrote of cold apartments and long food lines. Fathers wrote briefly, formally, refusing to admit too much despair. Some letters never came, and the silence left by those missing pages was its own form of torment. Yet even that silence proved something. The system was real. The Americans were not staging the exchange. The same was true of religious services. A camp chaplain, sometimes aided by interpreters and tolerated by command so long as order held, made room for Catholic and Protestant observance. It was not elaborate. A cleared hall, hymn sheets, scripture, prayer. The guards remained guards. The camp remained a prison. Yet the Americans did not forbid worship simply because the men behind the wire had once worn enemy uniforms. That fact unsettled the prisoners in ways some never fully explained even to themselves. If this kindness was false, why maintain it so carefully? If it was real, what did that say about everything they had been told? Winter sharpened all of these questions. Cold makes human beings impossible to flatter. It strips life down to fuel, breath, shelter, boots, blankets, and endurance to rise again before dawn. In battle, cold is a shared enemy. In captivity, it becomes administrative. Who receives extra blankets? Who gets repaired coats? How quickly are broken windows fixed? Who is taken seriously when illness spreads through a barracks? The answers to those questions reveal much about those in charge. The Americans adjusted as weather worsened. More blankets were issued where possible. Barack stoves were checked. Sick men were sent to the infirmary. Fuel was guarded carefully because theft could endanger everyone. Work routines shifted when weather became severe. None of this made the camp comfortable. The prisoners were still cold, still trapped, still sleeping in rows under rough blankets while wind moved outside like a living thing. Yet the camp was clearly trying to keep them alive. For some prisoners, that fact felt almost insulting. Open cruelty would at least have allowed them to hate with confidence, but a structure that preserved them without sentiment, without pretending friendship, forced them into a more painful uncertainty. The hidden price still did not appear. Instead came Christmas. Not a sentimental Christmas, not a miracle of sudden peace, but a hard wartime observance under guard. The mess hall offered what small improvement could be managed. Mail was handled with a little more care. A modest common area was decorated with scraps and tolerance rather than abundance, and the men were allowed to sing. That mattered more than anyone said aloud. German hymns rose on American soil behind barbed wire, while the world burned. The sound was tired and imperfect, but it was whole. Some of the Americans on the edges of the room recognized the melody of Silent Night. A few knew the English words. For a brief moment, the war's machinery seemed to loosen its grip, just enough to reveal something older than uniforms. That on both sides of that guarded room stood men who had once been boys at winter tables, boys who had expected warmth, family, bread, and candlelight instead of war. Christmas did not make the camp tender. It did something more believable. It made complete dehumanization harder to sustain. After that came the deeper winter, and with it the kind of steady labor through which character is either preserved or destroyed. The camp became a machine for keeping men alive against cold, boredom, resentment, illness, and memory. Prisoners hauled fuel, repaired fences, cleared paths, patched barracks. worked under supervision, and learned that ordinary labor can sometimes do more to quiet despair than grand speeches ever could. Some work details expose them to ordinary Americans beyond the core guard force. Farmers, mechanics, older men, women running households while sons and husbands were away. These glimpses did not erase hostility. They complicated it. The enemy began to look less like a single monstrous idea and more like a country full of ordinary lives carrying war in ordinary ways. Back inside the camp, the Americans continued being what they had been from the start. Not warm men, not gentle men, not men free of anger or loss, but men who, taken together, operated a prison without surrendering themselves to cruelty. They enforced rules. They punished violations. They watched for escape attempts. They searched bunks. Yet they did not casually indulge in humiliation. The prisoners kept waiting for the real test, the crisis that would strip away discipline and reveal what the Americans truly were. That crisis came on a night of wind and smoke. It began with weather. The day had been rough, the sky tense, the air sharp. After dark, the camp settled, though never fully. Barack stoves were fed. Men rolled into blankets. Guards moved through their rotations. Then the wind strengthened. Boards rattled. Dust hit walls. Somewhere a stove draft misbehaved. Somewhere else a guard lifted his head and smelled smoke where smoke should not have been. In one part of the camp, sparks appeared where sparks had no business being. Then voices rose. Then more voices. Then the whole camp was suddenly awake. Fire had caught near one of the structures at the edge of the compound. Whether from equipment failure, accident, or wind-driven chance, no prisoner ever knew. What mattered was speed. Dry wood, store materials, tar paper, and hard wind joined forces at once. Flames spread quickly. Smoke dropped low. Men woke coughing, confused, disoriented, certain that at last a hidden cruelty had arrived. Some thought this was sabotage. Some thought it was punishment. Some were sure that if they rushed out under shouted American orders, the guards would fire into the chaos. That was the logic fear had prepared them to expect. For a few long seconds, some of them hesitated. That hesitation might have killed many had the Americans behaved as the prisoners feared. But they did not. The guards did not stand back and aim rifles at the doors. They ran into the smoke. They kicked open jammed entrances. They smashed windows. They dragged half-conscious men from bunks. They shouted in English and in broken German. Out! Move! Schnell! Here! Carry the sick. Leave your things. Medics ran toward the danger. Kitchen crews came with water and blankets. Clerks, drivers, mechanics, and off-duty personnel became firefighters because there was no one else to do it. Bucket lines formed. Hoses were hauled. Fence sections were torn apart where needed. Pathways filled with smoke, sparks, mud, freezing water, and shouting. In one barracks, a fallen beam blocked an exit. Prisoners screamed that they were trapped. The Americans attacked the obstruction with axes, crowbars, boots, and bare hands until a hole was open and coughing men were pulled through one after another. In another structure, sick prisoners could not move fast enough. Guards and camp staff went back in and carried them out. One American crawled low through smoke, dragging a prisoner by the collar, while another beat sparks off his own sleeves. The wind made the whole thing worse. Searchlights could barely cut through the shifting smoke. Water froze where it missed the flames. The ground turned slick and dangerous. Still the Americans kept going. Not one heroic figure, not a single saint, but group after group, line after line, men operating out of duty, urgency, fear, and something deeper than any of those things. One team hauled water. Another carried cots. Another pulled men from danger. Another treated burns and smoke-filled lungs in the open cold, because the infirmary was already overflowing. The crisis reached its worst point when one of the larger prisoner barracks caught so badly that part of its roof threatened collapse before all the men were out. Everyone understood it. The prisoners understood it. The guards understood it. And several Americans went in anyway. There was no time to admire them. This was not theater. This was not the sort of heroism meant for speeches afterward. It was action stripped down to necessity. Men were inside, so other men went after them. They emerged carrying prisoners over shoulders, between them, under them, then turned and went back again. Their uniforms blackened. Their faces streamed. Their hands burned. One stumbled under the weight and was caught by another before both went down. Around them, the yard filled with the terrible clarity of revelation. The prisoners watched and understood at last that the Americans were showing them what they had truly been all along. Not perfect men, not kind in any soft sense, not free from the war's bitterness, but men who, when the moment came, would not let helpless prisoners burn. By dawn, the worst was over. The fire had taken buildings, supplies, sleep, strength, and the last easy shelter of old lies. Smoke rose from black beams and ruined roofs. Ash mixed with mud. Men sat wrapped in blankets, coughing, silent, stunned. Somewhere hot liquid was being poured into cups. Somewhere a medic kept working. Somewhere an American guard stood in the cold without his coat because it had ended up on a German's shoulders during the night. Mourning after catastrophe carries a silence unlike any other. It is not peace. It is the sound of survival counting itself. Who is alive? Who is missing? What remains? What must be rebuilt? The Americans moved through that morning with practical discipline. The living were counted. The injured were treated. Temporary shelter was arranged. Food was improvised. Supplies were salvaged. Barracks were reassigned. Damage was assessed. No speeches were given. No one demanded gratitude. No one used the rescue to humiliate the prisoners for having misjudged their captors. The Americans simply kept working. For many prisoners, that was the hardest thing of all to absorb. Men can explain away a moment of instinct, but the morning after requires choice. And the Americans chose not to turn their effort into moral currency. They chose not to collect emotional payment. They treated burns, redistributed blankets, reopened the kitchen, patched shelter, and began rebuilding. That fact settled into the camp more deeply than any sermon could have. In the days that followed, the atmosphere changed. Not instantly. War does not release its grip in a single sunrise. But something fundamental had broken. The hardline men who had spent months insisting that American decency was only performance no longer sounded as convincing as before. Too many prisoners had seen too much with their own eyes. They had seen Americans run into fire, pull them from smoke, hand over warmth, kneel in mud beside injured enemies, and then refuse to make a spectacle of it afterward. The old suspicion did not disappear, but it lost its throne. In its place came harder questions. What did it mean that they had been wrong? What did it mean that the enemy had shown them restraint, order, mercy, and courage at the exact moment when they had expected bullets or abandonment? What else had they been wrong about? Those questions arrived just as more news from Europe deepened the moral crisis inside the barracks. The war was turning decisively. German cities were falling. The fronts were collapsing. Civilian suffering worsened. And then the growing revelations about the camps and crimes of the regime began pressing into the prisoners' world. Not every man responded the same way. Some denied, some minimized, some claimed ignorance, some fell into silence. Some were furious at the shame of exposure. Some, perhaps for the first time, began to see their own captivity inside a larger moral landscape they had never wanted to examine. The Americans did not need to stage lectures to make that reckoning painful. Their conduct had already done something crucial. By treating the prisoners with discipline instead of sadism, by showing real humanity in a moment of deadly crisis, they had stripped many of the captives of the easiest excuse available to defeated men. If the Americans had behaved like monsters, the prisoners could have carried hatred home as a final shelter. They could have said, yes, we lost, but look at what our enemies were. Yet the Americans had denied them that shelter. They had behaved too well for that lie to survive intact. And so the prisoners found themselves forced into something far more uncomfortable than resentment. They were forced toward honesty. Spring approached. Mud replaced some of the winter frost. Repairs continued. The rebuilt barracks smelled of fresh timber and old smoke. Music returned in small ways. Sports returned. Work details became less poisoned by muttered hostility. Some men planted small garden patches where permitted. Some translated notices for weaker prisoners instead of using language as a weapon. Some men who once would have hidden illness now called for the medic sooner. Some who had mocked chapel services now stayed longer after prayer. None of this meant the camp had turned sentimental. It remained a prison. The guards still guarded. The wire still stood. Orders were still orders. Yet a different pattern had begun to spread among the captives themselves. The Americans' collective restraint had become quietly contagious. Men who live long enough inside discipline sometimes begin to imitate its better parts. Then the war in Europe ended. The news did not arrive like a single shout, but like a pressure building across days, until the Nile could no longer hold. Germany was broken. The fronts had collapsed. The old order was gone. For the prisoners, the reaction was complex and painful. Relief came first for some. Relief that the waiting was over. Relief that they would likely live. Relief that bombardment and retreat were behind them. But relief was followed by dread. What home remained? What families remained? What country awaited them now? Others felt humiliation more sharply than relief. The world they had been told to defend had become wreckage and exposure. The Americans, though victors, did not turn the camp into a stage for petty revenge. There were no forced scenes of mockery, no triumphant ritual of humiliation. That, too, mattered. Even in victory, the Americans kept to the same line they had held all along. Power did not need extra cruelty to prove itself. The camp entered its final phase as a place of transition. Papers were checked. Lists were made. Health concerns noted. Transport prepared. Men began thinking not only about leaving, but about what story they would carry home. Could they say they had been starved? No. Could they say they had been randomly beaten, humiliated for pleasure, tortured, or left to die? No. Could they say the camp had been easy? Certainly not. It had been hard, cold, humiliating, monotonous, and emotionally punishing. But none of those truths erased the other truth. They had been treated as human beings, and when death came near, they had been saved. That created a burden of honesty. To tell the story truthfully would mean admitting that the enemy had not matched the monster they had been promised. As departure approached, the camp took on a strange tenderness that sometimes appears at the edge of parting between people who were never meant to know one another as human beings. Men sorted their few belongings, letters, photographs, repaired coats, prayer books, notebooks, utensils. The Americans handled transport with the same procedural firmness that had governed everything else. No grand speeches, no dramatic reconciliation, where had left too much rubble for such easy endings. But there was a gravity in the air that belonged to more than paperwork. The prisoners looked at the barracks, the towers, the mess hall, the infirmary, the chapel room, the rebuilt sections darkened by memory. They did not love the place. No prisoner ever loves a prison in any simple way. Yet many understood that behind those fences they had been forced into a kind of truth they had never expected. And then, near the moment of departure, when men were waiting by the fence line and trucks or rail transport stood ready, a sentence emerged that seemed to belong not to one prisoner alone, but to many of them at once. A German prisoner looked toward the Americans who had counted them, controlled them, disciplined them, fed them, treated them, and carried them from fire. He said quietly at first, "We thought you were here to break us." The men nearest him heard it. Then more heard it. The words hung in the air because everyone knew they were true. That had been the assumption from the beginning. That the enemy meant not only to hold their bodies, but to crush whatever remained of their pride and humanity. Then the prisoner said the rest. "But you showed us what was not broken." No one applauded. The Americans did not turn the moment into a performance. They simply received it. Yet the meaning passed through the camp with the force of something long delayed. For the prisoners, the words admitted more than gratitude. They admitted fear, indoctrination, and the collapse of a lie. For the Americans, the words confirmed something deeply important. They had been given power over defeated enemies, and more often than not, they had chosen not to use that power for degradation. That choice had been seen. The transports moved. Men climbed aboard. The camp began to recede. Some prisoners looked back. Some could not. The story, however, went with them. It went back across oceans into ruined towns, into kitchens and half-repaired houses, into conversations with wives, mothers, fathers, brothers, children, neighbors. Not every former prisoner told it the same way. Some softened their own earlier beliefs. Some remained bitter. Some omitted the parts that exposed too much about themselves. Yet many carried the essential truth intact, that the Americans had held them prisoner, yes, but had not tried to destroy what was human in them. The Americans carried their own version home. Years later, around tables in veterans' halls, in quiet conversations on porches, some would remember the German prisoners on the plains. The suspicion in those first days, the long winter, the hymns, the fire, the rebuilding, the shift in the prisoners' eyes, the awkward thanks, the sentence at the fence. Perhaps they told it plainly. Perhaps they said only that not every victory is won with weapons, but the memory endured, and that is why the story matters. Not because it turns war into sentiment. It does not. War remained cruel. Captivity remained captivity. Defeat remained painful. The camps and crimes of that era remain beyond excuse. This story matters because inside a century that offered countless examples of what human beings will do when they hold power over the helpless, there was also this, a group of American soldiers who refused to become less human than the enemy expected them to be, and a group of German prisoners who, in the end, found the courage to admit that mercy had reached them from the side they had most feared. That is a happy ending, not friendship, not simplicity, not a clean moral washing of history, but something harder and, for that reason, stronger. The prisoners lived. Many went home. Some carried one example of real mercy back into a broken world. The Americans carried home proof that victory did not have to rot the soul of every man who wore the winning uniform. And the camp itself, built from wood, wire, dust, mud, and wartime necessity, became the setting for a smaller victory that never appeared on maps. The victory of men who, in the middle of a world war, chose not to let hatred set the final limit of their humanity.